She stood at the kitchen court door of Elmswell Hall with her boots gone to mud. Prudence Hale, 19 years old. A wet Norfolk morning in October, the marsh wind coming in cold off the flats. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for a bed. She looked at the housekeeper in the doorway and she said it plain. "Could I sweep the ashes from your grates, ma'am, for a loaf?" She asked for the thing they burned, the thing they threw away every morning without a thought, and she did not beg, and she did not cry. Mrs. Crisp, the housekeeper, filled the doorway. Behind her, 14 servants had stopped their work to watch. And Mrs. Crisp looked the girl over, boots to bonnet, and she said, loud enough for all of them, "We don't feed every tramp the marsh blows in. Ash and cinders is the measure of what you're worth." 2 cruelties in a breath. Turned away, and named worthless in front of them all. But behind the housekeeper, an old woman set down a book she had not been able to read for 2 seasons. The cook. And she did not look at the girl's tired face. She looked at the girl's hands, and by the end of that fortnight, that old cook had put into this girl's palm the one thing she had never once let out of her own apron. If you ever had a real skill, a true one, in your hands, and the only way they'd let you offer it was by asking for scraps at a back door, then this story is for you. Before we go on, do this one thing for me. Subscribe so the story finds you again, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, back to the girl at the door. Let me take you back a little first. Because to understand what she was asking for, you have to understand where she learned it. Prudence Hale was raised on Barley Farm, out past the fen, where the land was poor and the winters were long. Her mother was the farm's baker. More than that, she was the soap boiler, the one who kept the whole ashery, and there is a whole craft in that word, ashery, that townfolk have forgotten. Her mother knew all of it. She knew how to save the wood ash from the grates, how to leach water through it slow, in a barrel, to draw out the lye, how to boil that lye down with fat until it thickened into soap. Good soap, soap that cost real money in a shop, because the government taxed it dear. Her mother made it for pennies from the thing everyone else swept into the yard. And she knew bread. She knew the old brick oven the way a shepherd knows his sheep. She had a trick for it. She would scatter a handful of flour across the swept oven floor, and she would watch the colour come up. And she would count under her breath. If the flour browned too fast, the oven was too hot, too slow, and it wasn't ready. Just right, at the right slow count, and she'd load her loaves and they'd come out golden every time. No thermometer, just her hand, her eye, and a fistful of flour. She taught all of it to Prue. Every winter, in that warm kitchen, the lye, the soap, the flour on the floor, the counting. Then, 2 winters back, the fever took her, and the farm went the same way, only slower. Bad harvests. Debts to the miller, the father who couldn't hold it together after his wife was gone. And at Michaelmas, that's the autumn quarter day, the 29th of September, when farm servants are hired or turned off. The family let all the workers go. There was nothing left to pay them with, so Prue took to the road with what she could carry. She sold her mother's good wool shawl to a woman at a crossroads for the price of 2 nights' lodging. It was the last warm thing she owned. She let it go. But there was one thing she would not sell. Folded small, tucked against her breast where it stayed dry, was a scrap of paper. On it, in her mother's own hand, was the flour test. The counting. The whole trick of the oven written down so she'd never lose it. That scrap she kept. And that is who stood at the kitchen door of Elmswell Hall. Not a beggar, a girl with her mother's whole trade in her hands asking to be let near a grate. Now let me show you the house she was standing outside of. Elmswell Hall was a great pile of a place, home to Lady Ashcombe, who came of a proud old family and cared above all things for the family's good name. 60 souls lived and worked under that roof. and the kitchen that fed them all was in trouble, though the family upstairs had no idea. The cook was Mrs. Ada Loveday. 40 years she had stood at that range. 40 years. She had cooked for weddings and funerals and shooting parties past counting. There was nobody in that county who had fed more people better. But Mrs. Loveday had a secret, and it was eating her alive. She was going blind. The cataracts had come on slow, a milky veil creeping across both eyes. And she had told no one. She could still find her way around the kitchen by touch and by memory. She knew where every pot hung. But she could no longer read her own receipt book, the great leather book that held 40 years of her recipes, her methods, everything she knew. The lines swam, the letters ran together into grey, and she was too proud and too frightened of being put out to grass to say a single word about it. And here is what her blindness had cost the whole house. The bakehouse. There was a fine brick bakehouse off the kitchen court, a proper oven, the kind that bakes bread for 60. But you cannot judge that oven by looking. You judge it by feel, by the heat off the bricks, by a scatter of flour, and Mrs. Loveday could no longer trust her eyes to read it. So she'd let it go cold. It was fired only twice a week now, and even then she couldn't be sure of it, so the loaves came out heavy or scorched or pale. The household ate bread that was 2-3 days old, twice baked. Stale, and a house of 60 people that eats bad bread is a house of 60 short tempers. You feel it in the passages, everyone snapping, everyone tired. The laundry was no better. The soap they bought was cheap and harsh and never enough, because good soap was taxed and the housekeeper grudged the cost. So the laundry maids scrubbed with a lye so cruel it burned their hands raw and still left the linen grey. And Lady Ashcombe, who judged her whole family standing by the whiteness of her table linen, complained and never once asked why. So there they were, 2 proud women, both undervalued, both slowly failing at the thing they loved, a cook going blind in a cold kitchen, a great house eating stale bread and washing in bad soap. That was the debt owed, before Prue ever knocked. A house full of waste and want, and nobody able to see it for what it was. Mrs. Crisp took the girl in, not out of kindness. She took her in the way you might take in a stray dog to work the yard, because winter was coming and there was scrubbing to do, and here was a body that would work for almost nothing. A fortnight's trial. Board and a place, no wage to speak of, and they'd see. And the place she gave her was the ash house. Now the ash house is exactly what it sounds like. A little cold brick shed off the yard where they raked out the spent ash and the cinders. It was draughty and it smelled of cold soot, and it was no place to sleep. But Mrs. Crisp had a bed made up in the corner of it, on the packed earth floor, and that is where she put Prue. "You asked for ash," the housekeeper said, and there was a thin smile in it. "You may sleep in it." Prue said nothing. She made the corner as clean as she could. She slept in her clothes for the cold. At the table she was fed last and least. The other servants ate, and what was left when they were done, that was hers. She got the coldest end of the passage to scrub, on her knees, before dawn, the dirtiest work in the sharpest cold. She did not complain. Not once. She kept her head down, and she watched, and she learned the run of the house. And every single morning, her first task was to sweep out the grates. This is the part I want you to hold on to. Every morning before light, Prue went from hearth to hearth through that great house with her bucket and her brush, and she swept up the wood ash. Barrows of it. Fine grey ash from a dozen fireplaces that had burned all night. And every morning, the whole of it was carried out and dumped in the yard as rubbish. Thrown away. Nobody upstairs, and nobody in Mrs. Crisp's world, had ever once looked at that ash and seen anything but dirt. But Prue saw it. One dark morning, kneeling at a grate beside the laundry maid, a girl named Betsy. Prue ran a handful of the cold ash through her fingers and watched it fall, and she said it low, almost to herself. "Waste, there's lie enough in a week of this to whiten the whole county." Betsy looked at her like she'd spoken Greek. Betsy, whose own hands were cracked and scorched red to the wrist from the bad shop soap. She didn't understand. Not yet. But Prue had just said out loud the thing that nobody in that house knew, that the rubbish they threw out every dawn was worth money, was worth clean linen, was worth, though none of them could see it yet, the good name of the whole house. She had seen the treasure. She just wasn't allowed yet to touch it. Now Betsy became her first friend. Two girls at the bottom of everything, up before the rest, kneeling at cold grates in the dark. Betsy showed her where things were and warned her which tempers to dodge, and Prue, careful and quiet, began to be a person in that kitchen, and not just a stray. Then came the morning that changed the shape of things. Mrs. Crisp came into the kitchen sharp and impatient, wanting a particular thing done, a special dish for the mistress's table, and she needed the receipt for it. So she pulled down the great leather book, the cook's own book, and she thrust it across the table at Mrs. Loveday, the receipt for the almond cream. "Mrs. Loveday, read it out. We haven't all morning." And Prue, wiping down the far end of the table, saw the old woman's face. Mrs. Loveday took the book. She held it, she turned it toward the window light, and her clouded eyes moved across the page and found nothing. Nothing at all. Just grey shapes swimming where the words should be. And you could see the panic rising in her, quiet and terrible, the panic of a proud woman about to be found out in front of the housekeeper who outranked her and would love an excuse. Her mouth opened, no words came. And Prue, without a fuss, without making it a thing, stepped in close as if she were only reaching for a cloth, glanced down at the open page and read the line out, soft and steady. Half a pint of cream, a spoon of rosewater, the almonds blanched and pounded fine, as if she were only reminding the cook of what she already knew, as if the two of them were reading it together. Mrs. Crisp took the answer and swept out, satisfied, and never knew a thing. But the old cook knew. Ada Loveday sat very still after the housekeeper had gone, and she turned her ruined eyes toward the girl, and she understood two things at once: that this ragged marsh girl she'd let sleep in the ash house could read, and could think fast, and had covered for her, without being asked, without a word, to spare an old woman's pride. And Prue understood something too, in the same moment. She understood why the cook had stared at the book like that. She understood that the great Mrs. Loveday, 40 years at that range, could not see. Neither of them said it. But it sat there between them now, warm and secret. The old woman's blindness, the girl's kindness, a loop drawn tight around the two of them that nobody else could see. That should have been the turning. But this is not a house where being useful is enough. In this house, only rank counts. And Mrs. Crisp held the rank. Not long after, the housekeeper called Prue in to settle the terms of her trial. Betsy was there, folding linen in the corner, the one witness. Mrs. Crisp sat with her ledger open, and she looked at Prue the way you'd look at a figure in a column. And she cut the terms she'd offered, docked them. Less board, no wage at all now until the trial was passed, and the trial itself stretched out longer, the decision to be made at Martinmas. Martinmas, that's the 11th of November. A month off. A month of the coldest work for nothing, sleeping in the ash house, with everything hanging on the whim of the woman who'd already decided what she thought. Ash for bread, Mrs. Crisp said, and she wrote a figure in her book without looking up. That was your bargain at my door, a beggar's bargain, and a beggar's price. Don't imagine it buys you anything more. Betsy, in the corner, went still. She'd heard it. Prue said, "Yes, ma'am," and nothing else. But Betsy had heard. 2 offences now, the cold and the hunger. That was the first, private, small, nobody watching. And now this. The terms cut, the sneer, 1 witness in the room. It was building. And you know, if you've lived any kind of life, that these things come in 3s. The small one, the one with a witness, and then the one done in front of everybody. The 3rd one came at a tea. Lady Ashcombe had guests, fine people from 3 counties over, come for the afternoon, the kind of visit where the whole reputation of the house is on the table with the cake, and the kitchen sent up its bread, as the kitchen must. Only there was no fresh bread. There hadn't been fresh bread in that house for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The bakehouse was cold. So up went the twice-baked loaf, the stale bread crisped in the oven to hide its age, cut thin and hoped over. It came back down untouched, worse than untouched. It came back on the tray with a message from above. The guests had found it stale. Lady Ashcombe was mortified before her friends. The whole kitchen felt the shame of it roll down the stairs. And Mrs. Crisp needed somewhere to put that shame. She would not take it herself. She would not lay it on Mrs. Loveday, 40 years a cook. Not out loud, not in front of everyone. So she turned, in the middle of the kitchen, before 14 of the staff, the same number that had watched at the door, and she turned it all on to the girl from the ash house. She said it was the irregular meddling, the strange new girl poking about the grates and the ash and putting notions in people's heads. She said the oven was cold and the bread was a disgrace, and it was of a piece with taking in marsh tramps who asked to sweep cinders. And then she drew herself up, starched and cold, and she delivered the line she'd been sharpening since the door. Ash and cinders, that's her measure, and that's the whole of what she'll ever earn under my roof. Silence in the kitchen. 14 faces. Betsy staring at the floor, and Prue standing there with the cold ash of 100 grates under her fingernails, named worthless again, in public, for a cold oven that was not her fault, and a skill in her hands that not one of them knew she had. She did not answer back. She did not cry. She held herself very still, and she took it. But something set hard in her that afternoon. Not rage. Something quieter and more dangerous than rage. Resolve. That was the bottom. Sit with the girl at the bottom for a moment, because everything after this climbs. That night, the house dark and cold, Mrs. Loveday found her. The old woman had been humiliated too. In her own silent way, it was her oven, her bread, her 40 years being called a disgrace up those stairs, and she knew it even if Crisp had aimed the words at the girl. She found Prue in the corner of the ash house by the light of a single stub of candle, and she sat down heavily on the edge of that mean little bed, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then the truth came out of her. All of it. "I can't see, child." Her voice was low, and it shook. 2 seasons now. More, I can't read a word of my own book. I can't read the heat off that oven. 40 years I could tell you to a breath when a loaf would take, and now I put my hand near the bricks and I can't be sure. So I let it go cold. God forgive me, I let the bakehouse of this house go cold rather than say out loud that I've gone blind. She pressed her ruined eyes with the heel of her hand. And there's no one behind me, no one trained. When I go, it all goes with me. 40 years, into the dark, and nothing left. And there it was, opened all the way now. The secret laid bare between them. The old cook was not just going blind. She was watching everything she knew die in her hands, with no one to catch it. And Prue reached into the front of her dress, to the place she kept dry against her heart, and she drew out the scrap of paper. Her mother's hand. "The flour test." "I have hands, Mrs. Loveday," she said. "And I have this." She read it out to her in the candlelight. Her mother's own words. "Scatter a handful of flour across the swept oven floor. Watch the colour come. Count slow." and she told the old woman about her mother, the baker and the soap boiler of Barley Farm, and the whole ashery, and the winters spent learning every part of it. She told her she could read an oven by hand, that she'd been doing it since she was a child. The old cook listened, and a thing happened in her face that hadn't been there in 2 seasons. Something lifting. "Show me," she said. So before dawn, while the house slept, and Mrs. Crisp slept, and there was no one to see, the 2 of them went out to the cold bakehouse. And they fired it. Properly, Prue built the fire and fed it, and let it come up, and she swept the oven floor clean with a long besom, and she waited, her whole body remembering her mother's kitchen. Then she took a fistful of flour, and she scattered it across the hot bricks, and she counted, under her breath, slow, the way her mother taught her. And the flour lay there white for a moment, and then the colour began to come. A soft, even brown, creeping across the scatter, true and steady, browning right on the count. Not too fast, not too slow, just right. "It's ready," Prue said. And Mrs. Loveday, who could not see the flour but could hear the certainty in the girl's voice, put out one trembling hand toward the heat she could no longer judge, and she began, quietly, to weep. They baked. The first proper loaves that oven had turned out in years. Prue worked the dough the way her body knew, and slid the loaves in, and read the heat, and drew them out golden, high and crisp and light, the smell of real bread filling the cold bakehouse in the dark. Mrs. Loveday broke one open with her hands, steam rising off it, and she smelled it, and she tasted it, and she said, there it is. That's the bread I used to make." Something turned over in that little brick room that morning. The pain of the night before was still there, but it had changed shape. It had become something with a spine in it, resolve, but Prue wasn't finished. There was the other half of her mother's craft, and it was time. Over the next week she did something so quiet that nobody marked it. Each morning when she swept the grates, she stopped throwing the ash in the yard. She saved it. A little store of clean wood ash kept dry in the corner of the ash house that was now, strangely becoming a kind of workshop. And when she had enough, she set a barrel, and she leached water through the ash slow, drip by drip, drawing off the dark lye at the bottom, the way her mother taught her. Then she got a little fat, kitchen scraps, drippings nobody wanted, and over a small fire she boiled the lye and the fat together, stirring and watching, until it thickened and came together and turned, at last, into soap. A small crock of it, pale and plain and honest. She cut the first bar, and she carried it to Betsy. Betsy, whose hands were scorched red raw to the wrist from months of the harsh shop lye. Betsy, who scrubbed the family's linen till her knuckles cracked and bled, and still it came up grey. "Here," Prue said, and she pressed the bar into those poor cracked hands. "Made it from the grate ash, the stuff they throw out every morning. Try it on the next wash." Betsy turned the bar over. She smelled it. She looked at Prue like she'd handed her something out of a storybook. Because Betsy knew what soap cost, everyone below stairs knew what soap cost, it was taxed so dear that Mrs. Crisp locked it away and doled it out by the sliver. And here was Prue, the girl who slept in the ash house and ate last, making it for nothing out of the very rubbish they carried to the yard. "For nothing," Betsy whispered. "You made this for nothing." "For less than nothing," Prue said. They were paying a boy to cart it away, and in that moment, in Betsy's raw hands, was the whole thing Prue had seen at the grate a week before. The waste that was worth the whole county. It wasn't a fancy any more. It was a bar of soap you could hold. So now, in secret, in the cold hours before the house woke, the ash house had become a forge of a different kind. Bread rising in the bakehouse where no bread had risen in years. Soap curing on a shelf where before there had only been cold cinders. 2 proud women and a scrap of paper, quietly turning the rubbish of a great house into the 2 things that house needed most. And not a soul upstairs knew a thing about it. But you can only keep a thing like that secret for so long. Good bread has a smell that travels. Clean linen gets noticed, and there was still the housekeeper, Mrs. Hester Crisp, who held all the rank and all the keys and had already decided, out loud, in front of 14 people, exactly what this girl was worth. Mrs. Loveday knew it too. She lay awake and she thought about it, about the girl with her dead mother's craft in her hands, about the 40 years in her own fingers that were nearly out of time, about who would hold the most important room in this house when she was gone into the dark for good, and about the fact that not one thing Prue had done, not the bread, not the soap, not the covering for her at the receipt book, would count for anything at all, so long as the decision rested with a housekeeper who saw only ash and cinders where a treasure stood. And so the old cook, blind and failing and running out of days, began to think about the one thing in that whole house that was still, entirely, hers to give, the one thing she had never let out of her apron in 40 years. She began to think about the keys to the bakehouse, and she began to think about doing it before Mrs. Crisp could ever be asked. The keys came out on a Tuesday morning, before the light. Prue remembers it was a Tuesday because the bread was already proving under its cloth, and the bakehouse was warm, and Mrs. Loveday had come down the cold passage on her own 2 feet with one hand on the wall. She stood in the doorway a moment. She smelled the yeast. She smiled at it, the way you'd smile at a voice you knew. Then she reached into her apron. 40 years, that apron. Prue had never once seen it opened for anyone, and out of it came the keys to the bakehouse, warm from being carried against an old woman's hip, and Mrs. Loveday held them out into the dark until they found Prue's hand. "Take them," she said. Prue didn't take them, not straight away. "Mrs. Crisp holds the keys in this house," she said. "It isn't yours to give, is it? Not really. The bakehouse is mine." The old woman's voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "Lady Ashcombe gave me that room 40 years back and never once asked it back. The larder's Hester's. The linen press is Hester's. The wine, the plate, the still room, hers, but the bread." She pressed the iron into Prue's palm and closed the girl's fingers over it. "The bread was always mine to give." And here Betsy, who'd come in for the morning warm and stood frozen by the door, heard the old cook say the thing that Prue would remember for the rest of her life. Keys go to the hands that know the heat. Hester, Mrs. Loveday, said it to the empty air, as if the housekeeper were standing there to hear it. Not the head that keeps the ledger. Then she did a stranger thing. She sent Betsy for the great leather receipt book, and she had Prue open it to the back, to a clean page, and she took the pen herself. She couldn't see the line. Prue had to guide her hand to the top of it. But she wrote, slow, in a hand gone loose and blind, that on this day she gave the keeping of the bakehouse to Prudence Hale, who held the craft true. And under it she had Prue write out the flour test itself, and the leaching of the ash, and the boiling of the soap, all of it, plain, in Prue's own steady letters, with the old woman's shaking cross beside it to say she'd witnessed it. Prue didn't understand it then. She thought it was only sentiment, an old woman putting her house in order. It wasn't. It was proof, written down and dated months before anyone would think to ask for it. Mrs. Loveday had been 40 years in a house run on paper. She knew that in the end, upstairs, the paper is the only thing that ever wins. "There," she said when it was done. She sat back. Her blind eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Now let them come and argue with the book. And then the quiet time began. The best weeks Prue had known since her mother died. Every dawn, the bakehouse fired. Every dawn, the flour scattered on the swept oven floor and browned true in a slow count, and the bread went in, and came out an hour on gold and singing. Fresh bread. Not the grey, twice-baked brick the house had choked down for 2 years. Fresh, every single day, on 60 plates from the scullery to the mistress's own table. And a house is a strange animal. It doesn't know why it's happy. It just is. The footman stopped snapping at the hall boys. The maids sang at the stairs. Mr. Fenn, the steward, who was a dull, decisive man and never noticed a thing that wasn't in a column, remarked to no one in particular that the servants' dinner had got very tolerable of late. Lady Ashcombe said the toast at breakfast was much improved and asked if the cook was well. Nobody could have told her why. 60 people, warmer in their tempers, and not one of them could have named the girl in the ash house who'd done it. That was the whole joke of it. Prue did the work in the cold black hours and was back to sweeping grates by the time the house woke. The bread appeared like weather, like it had always been there. And once a week, the ash, every grate in that house, swept out cold each morning, a whole great house of fires, and all of it carried down to Prue, who leached it slow through a barrel of straw and rainwater till the water ran sharp and brown and would float an egg. Free lie, out of the very dirt they paid a boy to cart away. She boiled it down with the kitchen's saved fat, and skimmed it, and salted it, and set it on the shelf to cure hard. Soap, good white soap, the kind you paid dear for in the town, because the Crown taxed every pound of it that came out of a maker's boiler. But this soap came out of nobody's boiler that the taxman knew. It came out of ash. And there was no tax on ash. There was no tax on rubbish. Prue gave Betsy the first proper bar and watched the laundry maid go still. Betsy's hands, you have to understand, they were a horror. Cracked to the wrist, split at every knuckle, raw red from years of scrubbing linen with the cheap grey stuff that took the dirt out and the skin with it. She'd washed in that muck so long she'd stopped feeling the sting. She took Prue's bar. She washed a shift with it, and she stood there over the tub with her ruined hands in the water, and she started to cry. Quiet, because it didn't hurt. For the first time in years, the washing didn't hurt. It's just soap, Prue said. Gentle, it's not, Betsy said. It's not just soap. And the linen came back white, whiter than the house had seen. The sheets, the cloths, the mistress's own table linen that she prized above near everything, all of it coming off the line bright as new snow, because Betsy at last had soap that cleaned instead of soap that scorched. Lady Ashcombe held a napkin to the window light and said it was the best-kept linen in the county, boiled from ash, from the thing they burned. And she never knew. Now Mrs. Crisp was not a stupid woman. Hard, yes, starched and small and cruel with it, but not stupid. And a woman like that can feel a thing shifting under her feet before she can name it. She could feel it. Something in her house had changed, and she hadn't ordered it, and she hadn't sanctioned it, and that, to Hester Crisp, was very near a crime. So one afternoon she went down to the Bakehouse to catch it. Whatever it was, some rule flouted, some stores gone missing, some fire hazard she could shut down with the full weight of her keys. She threw the door open expecting ruin. She found a clean, warm room, loaves cooling in ranks, the floor swept, the trough scrubbed, the girl standing quiet with flour to the elbow. Crisp walked the length of it. She ran a finger along the shelf for dust. She lifted the cloths off the proving bread. She looked in the flour bins and the fat crock and found every one accounted for. She could not find a single thing wrong, and a thing being right, when you have come down to find it wrong, is its own kind of insult. She went straight to Mr. Fenn. That girl's in the bakehouse, she said. The ash sweep. Meddling with the ovens. Mr. Fenn looked up from his figures. Is the bread bad? That's not the... Is it bad, Mrs. Crisp? The bread's been very good. It is good, she said through her teeth. That's not the point of it. She has no rank to be in that room. It's irregular. Mr. Fenn was a fair, dull man. He weighed it the only way he knew, which was as a sum. Better bread, no complaint, no cost he could see. "Well," he said, and went back to his column. "I can't very well write you an order to make the bread worse." And the complaint died there on his desk. Relief, Prue heard of it and let out a breath she'd been holding a week. But Crisp didn't let go. Women like that never let go. She only changed her grip. If she couldn't prove the girl was doing harm, she'd stop her doing anything at all. She had the authority to move a servant where she pleased, so she pleased to move Prue. Off the bakehouse, back to the scrub brush and the cold stone stairs, the coldest work in the coldest corner, and she did it with a thin smile, because she knew, she thought, exactly what that girl was worth. Ash and cinders, that was still her measure. For 2 days, no one fired the bakehouse. Mrs. Loveday couldn't, blind as she was. There was no one else who could read the heat. And the house felt it at once. By the second morning the bread was back to the grey brick. Stale, sour, twice baked to hide the age of it. 60 people bit into it and remembered all at once what the last 2 years had tasted like. The tempers went short again. The footman snapped. Lady Ashcombe sent her toast back down and asked, sharp this time, what on earth had happened to the cook. Mr. Fenn came and stood in the passage and said mildly to Mrs. Crisp, "The bread's gone off again. The bread is not my. It went off the day you moved the girl." He wasn't a clever man, but he could match 2 numbers. "Put her back, Mrs. Crisp. I don't care about the rank of it. I care that the family's asking questions." So the housekeeper, white to the lips, was made to walk down to the scrub room herself and send the ash sweep back to the bakehouse she'd just dragged her out of. She didn't say sorry. She'd have bitten her own tongue off first. But she said it, the order, and every servant in that passage heard her say it. The house had chosen. It didn't know it had chosen. But it had. It had tasted 2 days without the girl, and it would not go back. And Prue, walking past her to the bakehouse door, said nothing at all. She'd learned that much. She just went and swept the oven floor and scattered the flour and counted the browning under her breath, low, the way her mother used to. And little Tom the ash boy stood in the doorway and watched her do it. "How do you know it's hot enough?" he asked. "Without you burn your hand?" So she showed him. She let him scatter the handful across the swept brick and watch it. "Too fast to gold, it's too hot. You'll burn the crust and the middle stays raw," she said. "Too slow, it won't rise. You want it to brown in a slow count. Like this." And she counted it out for him, and the flour went from white to gold in just that count, and the boy's face opened up like she'd shown him a magic trick. She thought nothing of teaching him. It was only kindness. It was only the way a thing gets passed on. But that's the other joke of it. That flour on the oven floor, her dead mother's trick, off a scrap of paper carried against her heart all the way from a failed farm, that little scattering of white was worth more than every key in Hester Crisp's belt, and she was giving it away for free to an ash boy. Because that's what you do with a real thing. You pass it on. Now Crisp had been beaten twice, beaten by Fenn's column and beaten by the plain bread on 60 plates. And a woman like that, beaten twice below stairs, does the only thing left to her. She goes over everyone's head. She went up, past the steward, past the cook, up the green baize door to Lady Ashcombe herself. The county shooting party was 3 weeks off, the whole 100 coming for Christmas, the gentry and the good families, and the one thing Lady Ashcombe cared about in all the world was that her house should show white and clean and above reproach in front of every one of them. Her name. That was what a great house was, in the end. A name. And Crisp knew exactly where to put the knife. "There's a marsh tramp been given the bakehouse keys, my lady," she said. "A girl off the road, 19, no character, no reference. Given the keys in a bargain, struck below stairs without your leave or mine. It's not regular. It's not safe. With the whole county coming to your table, my lady, I couldn't sleep and not tell you the good name of the house was in a beggar's hands. And Lady Ashcombe, who cared for rank and cared for reputation and did not care one straw for the truth of the kitchen because she had never once been in it, Lady Ashcombe was inclined to believe her housekeeper. Of course she was. Crisp had 30 years of service. Prue had a fortnight, and a mud stained him. The word came down the stairs cold. The girl was to be turned off. At Martinmas, the 11th of November, the very day, the very deadline, they'd named at the door when she first came asking to sweep the ashes for a loaf. She'd fed the whole house. She'd healed Betsy's hands. She'd made the linen white that would make the family's name in front of the county. And it was going to buy her exactly nothing, because the decision rested where it had always rested, with rank, with the head that kept the ledger. Mrs. Loveday was too blind and too frail now to climb those stairs and fight in the great hall. She could barely find the fire. When Prue told her, the old woman sat very still, and then she said, "Fetch Fen, and tell him to bring the year's accounts down to the servants' hall. All of them. And tell him the book. My receipt book. Have it on the table. What good's the do-it girl?" And for the first time her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with 40 years of something held back. "I told you. In the end, upstairs, the paper's the only thing that wins. Well, we've got paper too. Now go and set it on the table where they'll all have to look at it." So it came to the audit. The whole staff assembled in the servants' hall, the same 14 and more who'd stood and watched her named worthless, the footman, the maids, Betsy, Tom, the lot. Mr. Fen at the head of the long deal table. Mrs. Crisp at his right hand, chin up, keys at her belt, certain. Mrs. Loveday helped down to a chair by the fire, blind, patient, and Lady Ashcombe herself come down through the baize door, which she almost never did, to see this irregular business settled and her housekeeper upheld. Prue stood at the back, flower still on her cuff. "We're here," Mr. Fen said, "to settle the matter of the Bakehouse keys, which Mrs. Crisp holds was irregularly given. My ladies asked me to look into the propriety of it." He cleared his throat. He was a man who'd rather have been anywhere with a quiet column of figures. "Well, I did look into it, so I brought the figures." And he opened the accounts on the table, the whole year of them. "I'll read you 2 kitchens," he said, "because that's what I found in here. 2 of them. There's the kitchen that buys." He ran his finger down the ledger. "And there's the kitchen that makes. Let me read you the kitchen that buys first. That's the one we ran up until the summer." He read it out. Plain, in the flat, dull voice of a man reading a sum, which is the most damning voice there is. "Soap, bought in from the town at the taxed price every quarter because our own laundry soap failed and scorched the linen. There's the sum. There's the tax on it. Item, the town baker's bill. For every single week the bakehouse here stood cold and we sent out for bread. 2 years of that. There's the sum. Item, linen, good linen, bought new, because the old was burned past use by bad soap. 3 bolts written off this year alone." He looked up. "That's near £50, my lady. £50 a year, bleeding out of this house, on soap and bread and linen we could not make and had to buy." The room was very quiet. "And every quarter of it," Miss Fen said, "is signed off at the bottom, in the housekeeper's own hand. Mrs. Crisp read that ledger 4 times a year, and signed it, and never once saw the hole in the bottom of it." Crisp's mouth opened. Nothing came. "Now the kitchen that makes." He turned the pages forward. "Since the summer, since the keys changed hands." His finger went down the column, and it was a short column, and it was full of one word. "Soap, bought, none, we make it now. Baker's bill, none, we bake it now. Linen replaced, none, it comes off the line white and stays whole. My lady, since that girl took the bakehouse, This house is saving better than £4 a month. And it's climbing. He let that sit. £4 a month made, he said, against £50 a year lost. That's the difference the keys made. That's the whole of the irregularity I was sent to find. And then he did the last thing. He reached over and drew Mrs. Loveday's great leather receipt book across the table and opened it to the back, to the page written months before in a blind woman's hand and a girl's steady one. Dated, witnessed, plain. And here, he said, is the bargain Mrs. Crisp calls irregular. Written down. Dated the day it was made. The gift of the bakehouse, and every method in it, the bread and the soap both, set down by the cook who held that room 40 years, before anyone thought to make a quarrel of it. He turned it so the mistress could see. The only thing irregular in this whole account, my lady, is the £50 we were burning before the girl came. That's the irregularity. It's just that nobody ever wrote it down as one. Now watch them. Each of them. One at a time, because they earned that much. Mrs. Crisp first. The starch went out of her all at once, the way it does, and she had one thing left, and she reached for it, because it was true and it was all she had. A housekeeper, she said, and her voice was not steady now, a housekeeper must not be bypassed. Rank is rank. You cannot run a house where the cook hands keys below the housekeeper's notice. It cannot be allowed. Whatever the figures, the order of the house, that's true, Mrs. Crisp, said Mr. Fenn, not unkind. You should have been asked. That's quite true. And everyone in that room heard how true it was, and how it did not matter at all, and how small it sounded said out loud against £50 and 2 years of grey bread. She was right, and it was the most beside-the-point right anyone had ever heard. She knew it. You could see her know it. She stopped talking. Mrs. Loveday next. The old cook sat by the fire, and she couldn't see one word of that ledger. She couldn't see anything. But she'd heard every figure of it, and she sat there blind and smiled at the account she would never read, because she'd known the sums were true before Fenn ever opened the book. She'd known it in her hands for 40 years. She just smiled, at the fire, at the dark. And then Lady Ashcombe. She stood at the head of that hall in a house she'd never troubled to understand, and she was not a wicked woman, only a far-off one, and she'd just watched something get made plain that she'd never had to look at before. That the white linen she loved, the white linen that was her family's whole good name in front of the county, that it came off the line white because of soap boiled out of ash by a 19-year-old girl she'd never spoken to, that her reputation, the thing she prized above all, was made in the meanest room in the house by the cheapest servant in it. She looked at the girl at the back with flour on her cuff. She looked a long time. The keys stay with her, Lady Ashcombe said, and that was the verdict, and she gave it herself, in her own voice, in front of the whole staff. The cook's succession stands. See it's done properly this time, Mr. Fenn in writing. She paused at the door on her way back up to the world she came from. And Mrs. Crisp, the party's in 3 weeks. I'll want that linen white. Then she was gone, back up through the baize door, and she never in her life knew that she'd just staked her family's name on a barrel of ash. She only knew the linen was white. That was enough for her. That was all she'd ever asked to know. There's a small thing left. The best thing. A week on. The Christmas linen wanted washing for the county party, all of it, the whole great load of it, and it wanted soap. Good soap. The only good soap in that house was Prue's, cured hard on the shelf in the ash house that was hers to keep now, hers alone. And Mrs. Crisp came down to the bakehouse door to get it. She had to. There was nowhere else. She stood in the doorway where once she'd stood over a girl and named her worthless in front of 14 people, and now she had to ask that same girl for a bar of soap, for the linen that would carry the mistress's name in front of the whole 100. She didn't beg. She'd never beg. She just said, "Stiff as a board, I'll need soap," for the party linen. Prue didn't gloat. She'd never once lost her calm in all of it, and she didn't lose it now. She just reached to the shelf and took down a good white bar and put it in the housekeeper's hand. "You may have the ash again, ma'am," she said. "Quiet, not a drop of heat in it, when you can tell me what it's worth." That was all. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Crisp took the soap and went, and behind her Betsy had to press her cracked and healing hands over her mouth to keep the laugh in. And the county party's linen was the whitest in the whole 100. Every family that came remarked on it. Lady Ashcombe's name was made on that white, made clean and made proud, and she carried it like a jewel, and she never once, to the end of her days, knew it was boiled out of the rubbish they burned. Now, the next autumn, October again, a year on, the cold come back to Norfolk, and the marsh grey out the window. The bakehouse fires every dawn now, warm before the light, and Prue is cook of it in her own right. There's a girl of 14 just come off a failing farm 3 counties over, mud on her boots, hungry, the way Prue came. Prue took her in. Of course she did. Mrs. Loveday sits by the fire. She's blind altogether now, no light left at all, and she's at peace with it in a way she never was when she was hiding it. She teaches by ear and by touch. She'll hold a handful of dough and tell you by the feel of it whether the flour was good. She'll listen to the fire and tell you it wants another log by the sound of the draw. 40 years didn't go into the dark with her after all. It went into a girl's hands, and now it's going on again. Because that morning Prue knelt at the swept oven floor with the 14-year-old beside her, and she took a handful of flour, and she scattered it across the warm brick, and she counted the browning under her breath. Lo, the way her mother taught her off a scrap of paper carried against her heart all the way from a farm that failed. "Watch it go gold," she told the girl. "Slow count. Not too fast, not too slow. Right there. See it? That's your heat. That's how you'll always know." And the girl watched the white flour turn to gold, and her face opened up the way little Tom's had, the way Prue's own must have, once at her mother's knee. The old woman by the fire, blind, heard the counting and smiled. As for the housekeeper, she's still there, kept on but under. Now, Mr. Fenn saw to the order of it, and this time it was all in writing. She holds to this very day that no bargain should ever be made below the housekeeper's notice. She's right too, she says it still, to anyone who'll hear. And then she sits down at the servants' table, like everyone else, and she eats the fresh warm bread, like everyone else. That's the whole of it. A girl came to a great house in the mud and the rain, and asked, not for bread, not for coin, but for the very thing they threw away, the ash, the waste, the cinders they measured her worth in. And it turned out the thing they burned was the thing they couldn't do without. Ask for what they throw away, and you'll learn the worth of what they never learned to value. She had it from her mother, on a scrap of paper against her heart. Now a girl of 14 has it too. Comment the county or country you watch this from. I'd love to see how far this one's travelled.